Well, it's the end of the summer. The manure lagoons are starting to fill up. I can't wait to get started spreading, Brian.
Oh, it's too early to spread manure this fall.
Well, it's a little bit early yet, but there's a lot to get done, so you might have to get started pretty quick.
Well, this is the whole thing that it comes down to. There are manure lagoons that are starting to fill up, and people want to get going spreading that manure, but today we're going to discuss how to minimize the smell from your manure and how to maximize the nutrient gain and the overall yield that you're going to have on your farm.
When you talk about minimizing that smell a little bit, you may think this is all about neighbor relations, and that is a really big, important thing. You don't want your neighbors to be all upset because you're spreading manure and it's stinking up the area for a long period of time. But what I'm really concerned about, in addition to that, is keeping those nutrients where we want them in your soils. When you think about the smell from manure, you're smelling ammonia in most cases. That is nitrogen that's leaving your ground. You don't want that. That's why we're spreading the manure out in the field anyway. We want to keep as much of that nitrogen in the soil as we can, and timing plays into that big time. When you're talking about spreading manure in late August, it's still pretty warm. It's still humid, you're still getting rains, the soil is really warm. That fertility, some of it is going to be lost by putting it out this early. That's why Brian gives me such a hard time not to get too excited about spreading manure.
Well, what we're really going for here is it's nice to spread the manure, and you can look at it as a waste product, and maybe you do on your farm, but I look at manure as the best fertilizer that there is. We've tried many times to match up exactly what's in manure with commercial fertilizer. I mean, with the micronutrients, sulfur, everything, and we just can't equal the yield gains that we can when we have manure, because there are other things in there that I just don't think we really have a great grasp on. Things like bacteria and fungi, a number of things, including organic matter, that can really help out a crop. So what it comes down to, and what Darren was getting at here, is with this nitrogen that's in the manure, talking about that one nutrient specifically, nitrogen is pretty leachable. In other words, it can move down in soil with water. It also can denitrify and go up in the air. It can be ammonia, and when it's in that form, it does have a tremendous smell, and we don't like that. So what we suggest to farmers is getting that manure down, deep injecting it into the soil. So let's talk about that just a little bit.
So we're talking about using liquid manure in a field, and the best way to do that, rather than spreading it on top and then trying to till it in later, or even spreading it on top and trying to be right behind with a tillage tool, for the best utilization of that fertilizer, manure, you want to deep inject that product, say 6 inches, 8 inches, 12 inches down. We've even done some 24 inches deep. And you say, wait a minute, 24, that's kind of crazy. Yeah, that is a little bit deep. But what we're mainly trying to do is get some soil over the top of where that manure is, so that we've got a barrier there so the fertility doesn't leave. Now, nitrogen will move around in the soil a little bit, but with a protective cover of soil over the top, you'll contain the smell and you'll contain the fertility value of that manure.
And the reason why we want it so deep is not just to have a covering over the top of it. It's also because we want to have roots moving down further in the soil. What we find very often throughout our entire country is we've got pretty good fertility levels in the top 6 inches. You get to the next 6 inches deep, it's maybe marginal. You get down from the 12 inch to 24 inch range, and really it's pretty lousy. We don't have a lot of nutrients there, which means we're not going to have a lot of root growth down there either. Well, if we're going to get the very most out of every acre we've got to have a lot of root growth down deep in the soil. And also just think about it. If we've got water late in the season that we can access down 12 to 24 inches deep, wouldn't it be kind of nice if we had some plant food to go along with that? You'll have better yields on your farm, I'll absolutely guarantee you. The other thing is you can build new topsoil down a little bit deeper in the soil if you deep inject your manure, you get roots going down there, and then those roots decay over a period of time. So it's a good thing all the way around. And one of the other things that comes up quite often when we talk about manure, and if you are a livestock producer, you probably know that manure contains a lot of phosphorus, and phosphorus is the big thing when you're talking to any state agency in terms of how much manure you can apply. They get worried about phosphorus moving off-site and contaminating waters. That's another reason why we want that manure injected deep.
Well, the big thing with phosphorus is it's usually the limiting factor for algae growth in rivers and streams and lakes. So if you add some phosphorus to that fresh water, all of a sudden you end up with algae blooms. Well, we don't want to see algae out there. We don't want to see a green scum layer on top of our fresh water. So that's why we're very concerned about phosphorus. The only way we're going to get phosphorus into those waters is by soil runoff and surface water pushing soil into streams and rivers. So if our soil up in the top few inches has all our phosphorus, our risks of having issues are much greater. If we can get that phosphorus down deep in the soil by deep injecting as much as possible, that changes the game, because now our soil at the top doesn't have very much phosphorus. Also, by deep injecting, we can leave that fertilizer down deep. We can put it out for a year or two's worth of crop, and that phosphorus doesn't move around in the soil. So it's protecting the environment as well by putting that phosphorus down deep.
Okay, one of the last things I wanted to bring up with this whole manure discussion is you've got to take a look at what the nutrients are in the manure. Make sure that you're having your manure analyzed. It's obviously pretty easy when it's liquid manure as long as you're stirring your pit. Now on our farm, what we'll typically do is we'll go with some manure and some commercial fertilizer so we can spread that manure out over more acres. We have less issue with potentially overdoing it on fertilizer and on nutrients, and we end up with better yields because we can get the manure, at least to some degree, on quite a few more acres.
So with manure, we want to wait until the ground cools down a little bit, deep inject it as much as possible, and then that way you can maximize the fertility value and also minimize the smell and the other problems associated with manure.
Well, one of the problems that could show up with manure is you might have a few more weeds because of that good fertility in your soil, and this weed may show up quite often. We'll talk about how to control it coming up later in the show.